So now we're going to talk about building resilient systems and how I believe threat modeling can help you achieve resilience. But first, we'll start with who I am. My name is Blake Hyatt. I am uh, I'm from America, in case you haven't noticed by my accent already. So I also apologize for any of the Z's that I've thrown around here, or Z's, excuse me. I don't know how to spell it in British. I'm from Orlando, Florida. 2 years, I've lived in Denmark, in Copenhagen, and I've been in cybersecurity for about 10. I'm a senior security and risk management consultant at WithSecure. My primary role here is in threat modeling. I'm the threat modeling service lead for our team, but I also do cyber maturity assessments, gap analysis, and I'm primarily focused on OT, ICS, industrial control systems, cloud, software development. But as it comes to threat modeling, secure design, and architecture is the primary objective. But enough about me. Let's talk about security resilience. So for the purposes of this talk, I will define security resilience as the ability for a system to maintain security outcomes despite changes in security factors. There's a couple key terms here, right? So we'll define what those are. Wrong direction. So security factors. These are what I would call external factors over which you have little or no control. So when we talk about the cyber threat landscape, we're talking about TTPs of attackers tactics, techniques, and procedures, for those who aren't familiar, of attackers, nation states, things like O-days, new vulnerabilities, right? These are all things that are constantly changing. We're constantly learning new ways to own systems and break systems, and the attackers are as well. So it's important for us to kind of understand that these things are going to be changing and build a system that is not chasing these vulnerabilities, right? We'll also talk about regulatory compliance requirements. The EU is huge for this right now. They're pushing out a ton of new regulation that specifically calls out resilience as like a primary objective. And that's across a ton of different domains. If you haven't been hit by new compliance and regulatory requirements, you will be. Just wait. Then there's supply chain vulnerabilities, right? These are your dependencies, your third-party risks, the integrations that you're using for other systems, whether you're calling in libraries, whether you're directly connecting with other third-party suppliers. If they get owned, if that library gets hacked, how does your system respond to, basically a backdoor into your system, right? We also talk about technological changes. A huge one here, AI, obviously, soup du jour. But there's also things like the changing landscape of cryptography with quantum compute, right? How do we build a system that is able to withstand attacks of the future? We can also think about environmental conditions. So this is your natural disasters, power outages, other environmental things, as well as economic and political factors, right? Changing landscape, the political landscape, wars, things like that, ultimately changes who threat actors are targeting and may change the scope or the expectations of whether or not you're actually a target for nation states. And then we talk about security outcomes. So these are the kind of fundamental security objectives that you're aiming to achieve, right? We have confidentiality, integrity, and availability. You guys are all, I'm sure, very familiar with those. But there's also accountability, right? The log integrity, being able to understand who took what action within your system. Another key one here is recoverability. If you have SLAs, uptime requirements, which basically everyone does, you want to know how well your system can respond in the event of an incident and recover back, full business operations. And then the final one there is assurance, right? And this is referring specifically to how effective the controls that you've implemented are and whether or not they are still providing you the value that you believe they are, right? So this is where you start to think about validating these things through pen tests, and et cetera. Yeah, so when we talk about regulations, right, we talk about things like DORA. DORA is a very big one right now. So this is for financial institutions specifically. And the kind of language here is that financial institutions must be resilient against cyber attacks, right? And this is uptime, being able to recover, as I mentioned before, but ultimately it is called out specifically as, in the name of the regulation, right? Digital Operational Resilience Act. Very similar that we're seeing with NIS2, which is coming into effect across Europe. This one actually dictates very specifically that critical infrastructure must minimize societal impact. That's a security outcome that they have mandated in the regulation. So very important that you're considering the societal impact when you're thinking about what would happen if an attack were to succeed on this system. And then the third one I'll highlight is the Cyber Resilience Act. So this is a new act for when you are putting products that have software in them onto the European market. right? They specifically call out that the system must be designed, or the product must be designed with resilience in mind, and security must be part of the planning and design stages, right? Another kind of key thing here, which has caused a lot of uproar, is that vulnerabilities must be addressed throughout the product lifecycle, right? So as long as you have this support cycle for the product, as long as the product is being sold on the market in the EU, they are mandating that you must address vulnerabilities, which is, I mean, a pretty big ask for a lot of products that get shipped out and aren't connected to things. But yeah, so now we all have a mutual understanding of resilience. Let's talk about threat modeling, right? So what is threat modeling? I like to point to the Threat Modeling Manifesto. I think it's kind of the boiled down version of what threat modeling is, right? So this is defined by them as the process of analyzing representations of a system to highlight concerns about security and privacy characteristics. Now, they highlight 4 key questions that you're asking when you're doing threat modeling. What are we working on? What can go wrong? What are we going to do about it? And did we do a good enough job, right? So as we're working through any threat modeling methodology or any threat modeling approach, we will basically always be kind of at its root asking these questions. Now, what that actually means when in practice, we're talking about defining what are we working on. We're talking about generating architecture diagrams, data flow diagrams, right? Drawing things on the whiteboard, generating UML, any sort of representation that allows everyone that's in the room doing the threat model at that point in time to have a mutual understanding and to be able to identify specifically, I didn't think the system worked like this, right? I thought these 2 things were connected, right? And that's the kind of dialogue that you're going to have when you're doing threat modeling that will help build your understanding of the way that your system is designed in a productive manner. Then we ask what can go wrong, right? This is where the core of threat modeling takes place. This is when we use things like tools like Stride, tools like attack trees, to begin to think like an attacker and try to imagine how the system could be used against the initial design, against the intended design. This is where we highlight the security and privacy characteristics from that first quote there. Next, we'll talk about what are we going to do about it. This is where we prescribe controls or risk treatments. So this is when we have identified that there is a potential impact here or a potential attack vector that could be compromised. You actually put controls into the system and then kind of redo the flow. Does this adequately address the problem that we're trying to address? And then the final element here, which I think is just as important as any of the other steps, is did we do a good enough job yet? This is where you do metrics, you integrate metrics into your system, you do reevaluation, you do things like pen testing to evaluate whether or not the design that you implemented, the secure design that you implemented, is actually secure. Now that we know kind of what threat modeling is, let's talk about what it's not, right? Oftentimes I hear people refer to it as penetration testing on paper. I take a bit of umbrage with that definition as the threat modeling service owner. Of course I would. A couple key differences here. When we're talking about threat modeling, we are talking in the world of the theoretical, right? And that gives us a lot of flexibility. That gives us a lot of power when we're having these discussions. Whereas when you're doing pen testing, you are almost invariably working within the practical, right? So when we're doing pen testing, it's somewhat limited by the skills of the testers. I mean, no shade towards any of my fellow offensive security folks, but if you need to emulate a nation state attacker on a system, you need someone who has nation state skills, nation state tools, and we're not throwing around 0 days. We do responsible disclosure. We're not going to own your system the same way, say, a nation state would, right? So threat modeling gives us the power to deal in that theoretical space and work through the kind of theoretical possibilities, and then build controls based off that theory instead of needing something to be proven out through a penetration test. And to that point too, when we talk about shift left security, I agree completely with Nick when he says shift everywhere security. I think that's a much better characterization. But when people are talking about shift left security, the way to do that is through threat modeling, right? We can do threat modeling at the system design stage, at the requirement stage, before the system is built effectively, meaning that you can integrate security as part of the design, and you're also not chasing bugs or vulnerabilities on the back end, right? Penetration testing requires that the system is built for someone to actually test the system, so you necessarily have to go back and rebuild when something is identified. Yeah, so let's dive in a little bit into the threat modeling methodology. So there are a ton of ways to approach threat modeling. You may be familiar with Microsoft's threat modeling approach, OWASP, there's Stride, there's Pasta, Linden, Octave, OctaveS, Octave Allegro. There's a million different ways that you can approach threat modeling, but I like to boil it down to this kind of core relationship here. What we're evaluating when we're doing a threat model is we are evaluating the assets that are in the system and ultimately the relationship that the threat actors we're concerned about have with those assets, right? So if we look at I think this will do this, right? Threat actors are not generally targeting a system because they want to exploit the vulnerabilities, right? I mean, there may be some of that in the finding a vulnerability is the initial foothold or the interesting thing that will trigger a threat actor to spend more time there. But ultimately, they're not there just for the lulz most of the time. They're there because they're targeting assets within your system, right? So in order for you to understand what a threat actor might target within the system, you have to start with the assets. So identifying the things of value within the system that a threat actor may want to target, right? So we'll start there, and then we'll kind of do what Microsoft calls decomposing the system. This is that first step of the threat modeling methodology or the threat modeling manifesto of what are we working on, right? We start to map out within the system, what is the attack surface, where do the assets exist within the system at any point in time? This could be when it's at rest, in transit, or in use, right? So we will map out the system using architecture diagrams, data flow diagrams, things like that, anything that builds that mutual understanding within the room. And then we'll take a step back and think about the threat actors, right? We've defined what they would target. Now we need to think about who would target us and why would they target us, right? This gives us the kind of context, the thinking of the threat actors and the objectives, gives us the context that the threat actors are approaching the system from, and gives us the power to kind of put ourselves in the threat actor's shoes and start to evaluate the kind of context or the objectives within the system so that we can then start to identify what vulnerabilities they might exploit or what kind of capabilities they would have when it comes to exploiting vulnerabilities. Right. So when we think about a threat actor, if we define, say, a nation state as a viable threat actor because we're dealing with, we're a military contractor, for example, right? And we have state secrets that we're entrusted with utilizing, it's viable to think the nation state may be targeting us. So now we can start to elevate our understanding of the vulnerabilities that are potentially viable, right? We can think it is possible that they are burning a 0-day or 2 or 3 potentially, right? So you can start to kind of justify the spending for security or defense in depth approaches with your security by design. Ultimately, as I was mentioning just now with the security by design, we end up with controls, right? What are we going to do about it is ultimately measured here with controls, and then how we evaluate whether or not these controls were effective is the kind of follow-on steps after threat modeling is done. Okay. Now that we're all threat modeling experts, let's think about how we can define or utilize threat modeling for security resilience, right? So I've kind of highlighted 3 key activities or 3 key objectives when you're approaching threat modeling that could be useful for building security resilience within the system, right? So we'll define the security outcomes, then we'll try to strike that balance between usability and security, and then we'll identify the critical guardrails for our developers to make sure that they stay on the path that we've decided. Right. So what does it mean to define security outcomes, and how do we use threat modeling to do this, right? So when we're talking about identifying the assets within the system, the things of value, we're ultimately talking about business assets and security assets. It's useful to separate these things because business assets are the things that drive value for the business. Security assets are things that an attacker may want to target on the path towards those business assets, but are not necessarily the primary objective, right? So when we are doing this in threat modeling, we would put on the board, right, business assets, user data, proprietary data, user funds. These are things that are somewhat tangible, or as tangible as things can be in our digital world. But then we also have these intangible assets, right? System availability, reputation. These are things that if a security or if an attacker were to target the system, maybe they would be aiming to take the system down, to harm your reputation, deface a website or something like that. So it's important to consider both these intangible and the tangible outcomes as well, right? And some examples of security assets: authentication tokens, user session tokens, GitHub credentials, security logs. These are all things that attacker may want to hit at some point, but are not necessarily the reason why they're targeting the system, right? So then we think about the threat actors and their objectives. So mapping this out kind of just as an example, We think a malicious insider or a malicious user, someone who has authorized access but is using it for nefarious purposes. Then cyber criminals or state actors. One of the benefits of doing this and really identifying all the objectives and thinking of from the perspective of the attacker, as you can see here, we've kind of identified 3 or 4 common attack vectors that we're concerned about, right? Or objectives that are relevant for this imaginary system, right? So we can look at this and say, stealing user funds, a malicious user, a cyber criminal may want to try and do that. Less likely for a state actor because they're generally not financially motivated, and less maybe for a malicious insider because reasons, right? It's an imaginary system, so it's not really dreamt up that much. But we'll say exfiltrate proprietary data is a core objective across all of these threat actors. So we can then look at that as a primary objective that we will threat model first, because it's one that we have identified as significant impact and likely to be happening across the board. So using this relationship, the relationship between systems assets and the objectives of a threat actor, we can shift our focus from vulnerabilities, from misconfigurations, from 0 days to security outcomes we want to achieve, right? We want to protect our proprietary data. That is the prime target within the system. How are we going to do that, right? We can define those kind of positive cases for the as an inverse of the attack objectives, right? So that's a useful way to kind of define security outcomes, and that's with the first couple steps of threat modeling. Now, talking about striking a balance, right? I stole this this graphic from an article by Kelly Shortridge on YOLOSEC and FOMOSEC. If you haven't read it, it's a very fun read. She's a very funny writer, and I think she has some really valid points here in this article, right? We talk about the kind of horseshoe theory of security strategy, where one end of the horseshoe is YOLOSEC, right? Just YOLO, for those who aren't aware, is you only live once, right? Where we're, not considering security impacts at all, versus FOMOSEC, where we're maybe overemphasizing security, right? So on the YOLOSEC side, right, prioritize business objectives despite the security impacts. So this is disregard of security fundamentals, secure coding standards. What are those, right? Piles of security tech debt. So maybe you're doing compliance pen test every year, and you're gathering all those findings and throwing them into the backlog and saying, we'll get to that someday, right? This is the anti-patterns that we're identifying here for YOLOSEC, right? So when you think about this, you can think, you're junior developers, Thelma and Louise, blasting off the side of a cliff because that's the fastest way down the delivery mountain, okay? When we start thinking about FOMOSEC, this is the overcorrection, right? This is prioritizing security objectives despite the operational impacts, right? So impacting your ability to deliver on, or your business's ability to deliver on their business objectives. So this is, over collection of data, alerting on every single possible attack, and basically, creating that alert fatigue, buying every tool that you can, throwing every guardrail up on the system, addressing every risk to the detriment of the business being able to actually make money, right? This idea of perfect security. Ultimately, we end up in the same situation. Thelma and Louise have just blasted through all the guardrails you've spent all your money on, all your security budget on, and still end up flying off the side of the mountain, right? Okay, so thinking about security in the development, we will think when we're working through threat modeling, this is the kind of shift left concept that we've talked about quite a bit today, right? One of the major benefits here is that we can threat model much earlier in the standard DevOps iteration cycle. We don't require the system to be built, to be implemented, and we can be a much more proactive with the secure design of the system, right? When we think about how we can also kind of what follows from threat modeling early on in the process, when we talk about secure coding training, when we talk about security guardrails within your system, and when we talk about security testing, right, all of these things can directly benefit from having done threat modeling earlier, right? It's not just the secure design of the system, it's also building these guardrails, defining how the system should work before the system's built. That way you don't have to go back, as I mentioned, rebuilding before, right? An example of a useful security guardrail we can get out of threat modeling would be if one of the outcomes we're concerned about is that user A may access user B's data, we can define a user story to say, we want to ensure that user A never can never perform actions or can never see user B's data. So therefore, we must validate a user ID every time we call this, right? Every time the system returns a user ID back, we validate that it's, that it matches with the token that was that sent the initial request, right? That may be something that you're not thinking about actively during the design, or your developers maybe aren't thinking about. They're thinking, well, I got the token, I made the call, it must be good, right? But you can identify those kind of edge cases and build a stronger security baseline so that when they're in development, they don't kind of veer off the side of the cliff, as I mentioned before, right? So just a couple patterns for success here to kind of highlight. So when you're threat modeling, the best trick is to start with what is possible, then prioritize fixes for what is probable and impactful, right? So this is when this will help you strike that balance between usability and security, but it also opens up the kind of floor for the creativity of the people in the room, right? And next, I think it's important that you leverage the experience of the people in the room, and I think just as critically, make sure that the right people are in the room with you, right? When you have, when you're doing threat modeling, you maybe have the users, the product owners of the system, invite them into the threat modeling sessions so that you can get the perspective of people who are going to actually use the system and people who are face-to-face with the users of the system, so that you can identify earlier than actual implementation that, hey, this is going to create friction for the user and just cause them to avoid any of the security we've built into the system, right? That, you'd be amazed at how creative users can be when they're trying to avoid security rules, right? Yeah. Threat model early and often. So the best time to threat model was yesterday. The next best time is today. There is no wrong time to threat model. So I think it's important to start small and focus, specifically on features, right? A lot of the times people will say, well, we've got this huge system and there's no way we could threat model it. We're going to, or we're going to send the kind of FOMO-sec response is we're going to lock the developers in the room with security people and say, threat model this and don't come out until you've got a full threat model for this entire system, right? That is 100% the wrong way to approach it. You're going to burn everyone out and you're not going to get great results, right? Some of the kind of patterns we've seen here with this is like the upper limit being about 4 hours for a session, because people start to taper off, right? They can't focus, that you lose that creativity, you lose the entire point of doing threat modeling if you're doing it, kind of bashing against it constantly. But yeah, focus on the features, I would say, and it's much better to kind of take everything piecemeal as you're building than to try and do it all at once and trying to capture everything at once. Before you know it, you'll have a fully threat modeled system, so it'll work out nicely. Identifying catalog patterns as security outcomes, right? So when you've done threat modeling and you've identified an outcome that you're looking for, or a risk to the system, a design or an element that needs to be repeated across the board, there's no sense reinventing the wheel, right? Create those, create these patterns and document these patterns so that you can kind of put those to the side and say, yes, we all know we need to be validating that user A can't see user B's data. We don't need to address that. We can focus on the creative side of things, the out-of-the-box thinking that makes threat modeling successful in the session. And then the final one here, create actionable outputs when threat modeling. I mentioned kind of integrating this into security guardrails, but the worst thing you can do when you're threat modeling is to build this beautiful threat model with all these attacker perspectives and then leave it on Confluence and never think about it again, right? Create tickets, link those tickets to the feature, make sure that you're, when you are thinking about the way that you're solving these things, think about the way that you continue to solve them over time and not just how you solve them for this specific feature, right? Create those kind of guardrails that will keep the developers on the road and make it harder for them to go bushwhacking in either direction, right? Make it easy to do security. And that's should be one of the things you're thinking about when you're diagnosing controls, when you're building controls into the system, is also what your pipeline looks like and how the pipeline is worked through by the developers to keep them on the path towards good security. Yeah, any questions? Thank you.
In which case, oh, there's a
Couple.
So thanks, Vitor. So the probability of the attack vector and the impact, obviously impact's critical, but how do you, this is essentially a qualitative approach, but obviously a quantitative approach would be more precise in terms of the probability of the attack. So how do you balance the difference between quantitative and qualitative analysis?
Yeah, it's a hard problem to solve, right? I mean, quantitative is more accurate to the point that it is that you can tie these things, or you understand what the potential financial impacts of like service uptime are, or compromise of specific data sets. I don't know that that nut has been cracked really within the security space, but it is helped a lot by having that data. One of the methodologies I mentioned earlier, PASTA, is built basically entirely on that kind of foundation of having a deep understanding of your assets and the value that they bring to the business. And so I would say, if you're looking to implement kind of a threat modeling approach, one of the things to understand is like what your inputs are, and pick one that aligns best. Well, pick a methodology that aligns with the inputs that you have, right? So if you have that kind of quantitative understanding of the impact, PASTA is great. If you don't, you're not going to get anywhere with that, right? So it's just, yeah, there's no right or wrong way to approach it, but this is, yeah, as you said, qualitative, in that you are really just approaching this from that attacker's mindset and trying to put on the attacker's shoes and say, which way would I walk, right? Yeah.
First off, I love threat modeling. Before I ask my question, I'm a big fan, but it's expensive. It's difficult. We've got hundreds of thousands of applications. What do we do?
Yeah. Yeah, I would argue it's actually cheaper than fixing it in post, right? So that's kind of the value proposition. I think I don't have slides on this specifically, but one of the ways, to kind of integrate this into your developer cycle, and like I said, don't start with the whole picture. Start small. Start with every feature you're adding on. Or if the system's an O&M, you can start to like break it down into its subsequent parts, tightly scope it so that you're able to do something in 2 hours. And kind of rethink the problem for the system. But I think keeping it small, keeping it like, and integrating it into the kind of development process, right? The kind of way we've approached it in the past is doing like triage as an initial, like just asking the question, is this security relevant, right? Is this feature, does it touch authentication? Are we concerned about authorization? You can use Stride as a useful way for identifying that at like a high level, and saying, are we concerned about spoofing with this, tampering, yada, yada, yada. And then if the question if the answer to any of those is yes, it can justify the threat modeling exercise to, think about the feature from that kind of more offensive posture. That way you can implement the feature better than you would if you, kind of didn't think about it. And another thing on that too, right? One of the things we've heard from clients before doing threat modeling workshops, teaching them how to threat model, then basically having them put their hands up and say, this is great, but I'm never going to get approval for this in the budget, right? I'm constantly chasing the next feature and I've got the next 6 months planned out. How am I going to do this, right? And one of the things that the kind of senior engineers chimed in with was like, we don't have to do this as a concrete, like discrete task, but the fact that you go into program increment planning or you go into feature planning with this in mind will necessarily improve your security, even if you're not like making it something concrete. But I do think there is value in making it concrete, and because you can identify those kind of patterns over time and build the kind of catalog of threats and build a better understanding of your threat landscape, even without the kind of CTI input, the threat intelligence input.